Hi everyone, thank you for attending today's webinar on cybersecurity for SMEs. So before we begin, let us run through a quick house rules for the attendees. So please note that this session will be recorded for AiSP members to access after the event. Please do mute your microphone and type in any queries using the chat function or type in your questions in the Q&A functions. If you experience any technical problems using WebEx, do exit and rejoin the webinar. Please note that AiSP reserves the rights to remove any disruptive participants from the webinar. Here are the program for today. So without further ado, let us hand over the time to Mr. Tony Low to run through his presentation on understanding your responsibility on data and privacy.
Thanks, Karen, for opening up the session. Hi, everybody. My name is Tony. I'm part of AiSP. Bringing you this particular topic here. What I'd like to share a bit, understanding your responsibility on data and privacy. I think this is an increasingly important topic because as we get more digital, businesses get to collect more data, be it offline and online. I just want to stress it's not just online data. Even if you're collecting a form that from the customers in terms of when filling up the data, that's also considered data that is essentially under your charge as well. But before I go on, want to introduce AiSP. So AiSP is actually a team of professionals. We are kind of independent members who come together to form this community, this association, to help to do three things, right? Key things. We call it ACE, really to advance, connect, and excel. Advance meaning helping like-minded professionals internally or externally of the association to advance their knowledge through a series of content like body of knowledge. We work with different association, and today we have this cybersecurity awareness program, bringing this program to the SME, specifically for SME to uplift and get information on the latest trend and issues that is actually related to them, especially around the cyberspace. There's also other events that we run, program like Ladies in Cyber or Student Volunteer Recognition Program. But I think the connect is once you connect, and once you advance and understand the knowledge, you would like to connect, right? So we also do that part of the partnership, right? Connecting our ecosystem and partners through academic program, corporate sponsorship program, and so on and so forth. Even going on to work with regional partners, AiSP equivalent in other countries as well. Excel is where if you have in your company, you feel that there's some individual who has potential to pursue security or cybersecurity career and can help it back to the organization. Feel free to reach out to extend this to them, right? Especially on the AiSP validated information security program, which is a certification, and we do have formal certification things like QISP and so on and so forth, right? So this is where AiSP want to kind of as a whole bring the program to the SMEs. And under AiSP, we have this CAP, Cybersecurity Awareness and Advisory Program. I think one of the key mandate that I have, I actually am leading this program, is to really look at it from SME business owners. What are the cybersecurity requirement in order for SME to operate in this new realm, right? In the digital realm, especially with the pandemic, COVID, everything's going digital. Hence, we kind of look at it. So what are based on that fundamentals, we kind of curated a list of topics of content that SMEs, business owners can, or even staff within those organization can actually leverage on to create or to read up, right? The body of knowledge is a subset. The aim is to provide a breadth of knowledge. Later I'll run through some of the topics. At the end of the day, with that knowledge that equips by the businesses or individual, yourself and the individual can now go out and look at what are the areas that you need to explore and look at that becomes self-sustainable. And we look at it from a tripartite relationship, right, between us, professional organizations, vendors. That means because we also get vendors to come in to share some of this, some of the products and learnings, and even use cases, right? In webinars like this. And agencies today we have we kind of quite lucky with, so we have vendors today, Mastercard, agencies from CSA to kind of come together to share in terms of that awareness and what kind of things that businesses or SMEs have to look out for. So for us, we kind of break the CAP into three key program, right? Enhanced security awareness and training. So we kind of this is actually an awareness program that we are doing in this setting with the webinar, but we also have training that we're going to roll out coming soon, the e-learning. That means you can sign up and do a self-learning process. But subsequently, we were going to build. We have a safe. You have a portal that is coming up. We have a book of knowledge and knowledge that is going to share back to the SME community. That means it's going to be something that's going to be open, public to the SMEs themselves, and so our partners can actually come in and look at it. And lastly, is really trying to curate, not really curate, but getting vendors to participate in sharing back some of these solutions that is actually relevant for SMEs. And that will be actually be published back to our portal eventually, so that it becomes a point of contact for point of reference, for example, for SMEs owners to come and look at what the cybersecurity programs or even services or product. And we do have this e-learning that's going to launch soon, right? Where it consists of 6 modules. This 6 modules is just a teaser to share and to kind of lay out some of the key understanding for a business owner that's needed to understand in terms of handling cybersecurity within the company in order for them to go digital. So we have things like module 1 really just about the business landscape from the digital realm, right to module 6 is in the event something happened, how do you handle a reporting event, because your responsibility is not just about your business now. We have a lot of guardrails and regulation in place that some of this needs to be reported, and how are you going to do that reporting, right? And today's topic, privacy and data. So data breaches is on the rise. If you look at it, the numbers tells a lot, but just the numbers. But we talk about statistics, right? We have a record number of breaches, data, and some of this is actually quite common regardless if it's data, right? Human problems, human error is always in the play. We have data records that is being breached or loose, or emails being unknowingly being clicked wrongly and then get installed malware and things like that, right? So those are things that is happening today. It's because we are all digital, we are connected today through all sorts of things, email, phone, etc., etc. But that's why we talk about data breaches is inevitable, because you're not no longer just about data in your company, the data that's sitting outside, right? Your employees might be using some of the services or social media outside externally. How do we kind of prevent data breaches? But it needs to be managed definitely, because with the data explosion, how do you manage this? But you need to first understand your applications, right? There are 6 steps of it, right? So really understand, you need to develop a basic data protection management policy, like who and what and where the data is being used. There must be a registrar. That means you need to set up a registry of data that you're collecting. Understand where your vulnerabilities are within your company, because you need to actively pursue. This is something that you need to continue. So this 6 steps is actually a continuous process that any companies has to undertake regardless. But one of the key thing that if you look at it is complaint based and feedback. The key thing to data security and your obligation is open a channel for your employees, yourself, or even the public to reach out to you in terms of complaints or feedback, because this is actually important. Yeah, you need the community to support yourself while you're employed, while you're putting in place controls and especially around things like policies and management. This is actually where it's a continuous process for this 6 step. And your obligations also includes things like if in the event that you have data loss, or other things like unauthorized acts of violation. That means system are being unauthorized accessed by someone else beyond their limit. It can be anything. It can be someone within the company or outside the company. So unauthorized act doesn't mean that it's external. Sometimes employees might try and a non-finance person might try and go into the finance system to do something. It could be just to look, but it's also considered an unauthorized act. So you have to kind of differentiate between data and information. So what we need to really the reason why is data is something that you collect and keep within your company. And one of the thing to stress is it includes non-digital, that means anything that's on notebook, spreadsheet that's printed out, and all those needs to be protected. Information are things, are medium that you have shared, right? So there are two different things, but both equally important because it actually impacts and what kind of impacts the kind of policies you put in. And especially for customer data, one thing for sure, there are multiple of them, but one thing to note is point number 3, connect only what's necessary. This is actually something very important, not to do data hoarding, but only collect things that you need. So one important question that my colleagues always do, right? Do I need this data? Always ask this question before you put it into the request sheet, because the more you collect, the more the responsibility you have. The more responsibility you have, the more policies and cost overhead you need to look at. I think this is something, point number 3 is a very important um, conduit that you need to understand. And 6 as well, right? So in order to keep your footprint low, when you feel that the data is no longer used, please destroy them, delete them away from the system, because even data that you're not using get leaked, you'll be responsible. The company is held responsible for that. And also understand what kind of data you're collecting, how you classify them, because different kind of data, from public to sensitive data, have different treatment. So what kind of policies and management you need to put in terms of collecting data, in terms of putting them and storing them, right? So these are the various classification you can look at for reference. And definitely you need a clear set of governance rules, right? If you look at it, there are 5 key principles, but one of the key things that you need to start out with is clear accountability. Collecting data is one thing, handling data is another thing, storing and disposing, right? Who in the company who needs to have those access and need to set it up. So you need to have a clear metrics of who in the company have access to, as I mentioned, different kind of data, and why do they need them, and then apply certain controls in there, right? So because once you have that, the rest of it will follow in place, like putting a procedures of retrieving the data. How do I assess if that person who have access to data have risk? Do I need to do anything on tracking or classifying, and so on and so forth, right? So awareness, maybe for people who handle a lot of critical data, we need to do continuous learning in an awareness setup. And definitely there's a cycle to it. I mentioned collection is not the beginning, it's not the end. It's a continuous cycle. Once you collect it, there must be a proper way to share it, to store it, and to use it. Most important thing, once you don't need the data, please dispose it. This is actually something that a lot of organizations actually overlook, because you feel that I need the data, but the thing is, do you really need the data in the first place? And that's something that you need to keep asking yourself. And definitely in terms of issues, right? When you collect data, and what happens if there's some, there might be, if you look at it from a PDPA Act, right? PDPA, there's issues with key concerns, right? Am I collecting PI data? Is that person has a DNC policy set up as well? And definitely action to note is when I collect, use, disclose, and store and dispose those data, am I disposing, what kind of data am I disposing? Make sure that I dispose it in the right way, especially for PI data. And even before that, right, to collect the data, you need to have proper consent. What you must highlight and define what the purpose of that collection as well. Make sure you apply some simple reasonableness in terms of identifying the data. And definitely within, so we have the reason I put out this is from a breach management plan. You need to, when you're collecting data, always make sure that you have a mitigation plan in the event that something happens. So this is where PwC has put it what we call a CARE framework. You can see there's a contain, access, reporting, and evaluating. This is a way for you to, if you follow this as a basic framework for events that happens when you detected something happening, a data breach or a hack or something like that. That really, you need something similar on this case for your company. You can tailor this according to your needs in terms of organization policies and principles, right? Lastly, I want to leave you guys with a set of tools that PwC actually left, put it on the website where you can actually leverage on the easily, right? So there are a list of artifacts that the organization, your business, or even your staff can actually go and look at, especially things like the deep data policy starter kit, and there's some advisory guides, especially, and so on and so forth. You might want to go to this website, pwc.gov.sg, organization/health help for organizations. I think this is where you also can read a bit more in terms of some of the, especially around the business application in supporting and making sure that data privacy and protection is actually applied and your application is being defined and highlighted properly. Okay, with that, I will pass it back to Karen. A quick one.
Yep, thanks, Tony. So now let us move on to the next presentation by Uri. So let's hand over the time to him. Hi, Uri. I think you are on mute.
Hello there. Can you hear me now?
Yep, loud and clear. Thank you.
Okay. And you can see my screen as well. Is that correct?
Yep.
All right. Excellent. All right. Well, first of all, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here and to have this opportunity to share some of our thoughts as Mastercard about a topic that we feel doesn't get a lot of attention, despite the fact that we see relatively glaring headlines on a fairly regular basis about breaches and a lot loss of data and so on. So let me actually start with a quick intro. My name is Aruj Birney, and I currently lead Mastercard's global product for cyber and data. And my background has been in cyber for the last 2 decades plus, and across both sides of the desk, as a consumer and also then as a service provider. When I started off in cybersecurity, the focus was mostly on large organizations. However, as things have progressed, what we all know is that the world is increasingly interconnected and rapidly becoming more so. Cyber criminals and other malicious actors, as a result of this, have also changed their tactics. While they still go after the large organizations, they're also increasingly finding that getting to the large organizations is actually easier if they use an interconnected weak link, which in a lot of cases could be or is a small and medium business. Now, the impact, obviously to small businesses, most of which are quite unprepared, is that they're becoming targets. And because of the increased attacks, they're also suffering, they're losing business. In some cases, they're going out of business, and they're not prepared in terms of how they should respond, what they should do, and also what kind of remedies they have available to them. What we found at Mastercard through research, through studies and observations within our own business network of thousands of banks and tens of thousands of merchants, which is also backed up by independent studies, is that many of these attacks could have been prevented if these organizations, these SMBs, had some knowledge of what they were facing. If they knew what steps to take, if they had access to easy-to-consume solutions that enabled them to be more proactive in defending themselves against threat actors or in being better prepared to understand what was going on. If they had these things, they could actually have averted or prevented some of these attacks. So what we've done as Mastercard is we've created a place, right? We've created a trust center where small and medium businesses who are on that digital journey that most businesses are on today, that they can actually use this resource to access learning, to access solutions, and to better understand how to manage risk and how to respond when they experience a cyber incident. The spectrum of SMBs is obviously quite large. I mean, you can think about it from the single owner stalls and in hawker centers to companies with several hundred employees even that still classifies as SMB. So one approach doesn't fit all. And what we did there to address that is define 3 personas with differing cyber maturities, and we defined their journeys to make sure that they could clearly understand 3 things. The first, obviously, core cyber concepts. If you don't have basic knowledge, it is very difficult to understand why certain things happen, why you need to take specific actions, and so on. And then the second piece of it is also understanding how they could be attacked and what things they have in their possession or in their business that could be used against them. So having an understanding of the situation of your organization's risk posture is very important. And then lastly, but not least, ultimately, given all of the different elements that we talked about, they need to know how to protect themselves from loss, from business interruption, and they need to understand what options are available to them to be whole again, right? Whether it's a recovery program or whether it is an insurance policy against cyber attacks and cyber events, these are things that they need to learn and know about and be aware of, that there is availability of these things. So the Trust Center has a number of great resources. These are curated and continuously updated. This includes things that we've noted on the screen here, such as podcasts and videos, and all the way down to actual tools and solutions that we feel will actually enable business resilience. So let me actually get into a little bit more detail as I sort of conclude my statements. SMBs need to mature very rapidly, and they almost need to do the same things that their larger peers are doing. They need to focus on 5 things to start off with, at least. And the first thing they need to also understand is who am I working with, and will those relationships cause me any harm? Who am I partnering with? Who are my suppliers? Is there any risk because they don't follow good practice? That's very important to have in place. The second element is around understanding what they need to protect, whether it's their data, their intellectual property, PI information, or even their people. They need to know what are the different types of things they're going to need to make these areas and others more effective and more resilient. They need to have a plan. And a plan is important because knowing that when you grow your business, you add tech assets or you expand your footprint in terms of your business office and so on and so forth, you have to know how that's going to be protected and how you're going to manage that protection, how you're going to measure that protection. So that cybersecurity plan is a critical element that is very much required. It's not an easy thing necessarily to build out, but there are tools and solutions available that will help you and guide you to do that. The fourth element is around crisis management. And the focus here is more on resilience. How can you come back quickly when something bad actually does happen? And this can often be the difference between a manageable loss versus a catastrophic event that knocks you out of business. So and a crisis management plan can be instituted for organizations almost of all sizes. And it's not something that can only be done by larger organizations. So that's very important to know and to understand. And lastly, organizations should avail themselves of the resources. In this case, obviously, a bit of a shameless plug, but they should go to the Trust Center and, use all the information, become aware of how to do some of these things that I've talked about. And And as a result of that, I mean, they can actually inject a lot more maturity into their approach. They can inject a lot more confidence that the actions they're taking are going to have a positive impact. Now, what I would also say is that the key differentiator between cyber that is done well or not done well is awareness and education. One of the metrics that we had talked about earlier was the fact that 90% plus of security incidents that actually happen because of human error. And if your teams are more aware of what good cyber behavior is, then that could actually drive an improvement in your cyber posture and your risk profile. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it, Karen, back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Uru, for sharing. So now let us move to the next presentation by Veronica. Veronica, over to you.
Okay, hi everyone. I just wanted to check that you guys can hear me and you can see the slides.
Yep.
Okay, so let me just introduce myself. I'm Veronica from the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. I'm very happy to be here to share more about our Safer Cyberspace initiative with everyone. Firstly, a brief introduction to CSA. We are a government agency that oversees cybersecurity in Singapore, and our core mission is to help Singapore's cyberspace keep it safe and secure, to underpin our national security, power a digital economy, and to protect our digital way of life. So I think today's conversation, we will cover a little bit more into the digital economy. The digital economy actually creates a lot of new opportunities for businesses. And actually, we also see that it has been accelerated by COVID, as we have all been forced to go online, be it for work, for learn, to transact, and also to stay connected. So there are certainly new business opportunities. But at the same time, as we go digital, we also realize that this increasingly digital way of life does incur a certain cyber risk. We have all increased adoption in terms of the technological solutions that we're using, be it using video conferencing systems or cloud-based storage and so on. And if many of us recall, at the start of the COVID pandemic, we had little time to stress test the systems, and therefore, to a certain extent, in going digital in a hurry, sometimes they may not be fully tested against cybersecurity. We can also see that there has been an expansion in the cyber attack surface, for example, in terms of the spike in online transactions, the amount of digital devices that we're using to go online now. And CSE recently published the Cyber Landscape Report. It really talked about some of the avenues for threat actors to exploit, for example, security lapses with third-party service providers and so on. When we talk about cybersecurity, it's often to think of the larger enterprises and think that these are the prime attractive targets. And to a certain extent, it's fairly true. However, small businesses actually should not also be complacent. The common thinking is that small enterprises are smaller and therefore not as attractive targets and therefore not subject of attacks. And actually, we have seen that this is not often the case. Small enterprises are not too small to be attacked. I'll give ransomware as one example. Again, this infographic was taken off the Cyber Threat Landscape Report that CSA published earlier this year, and we did see a significant increase in ransomware cases. What was also interesting to note is that most of the cases reported were from the SMEs. The slide here just shows a case study that was published in the Landscape Report, and it basically helps to reinforce the point that yes, while smaller enterprises are sometimes not seen as attractive targets, the earlier presentation that Mastercard had also talked about how actually the investment in resources are sometimes not there. Because of that, actually small enterprises are not too small to be attacked. This is where I think this is worrying for CSA, because we do want to enable a safer cyberspace for enterprises. We want enterprises to be able to build the confidence to pursue the opportunities from digitalization. We want to make sure that cybersecurity is a critical enabler and it doesn't become something like a showstopper to you. I was earlier in a presentation and a webinar with somebody from Frost & Sullivan who provided some statistics showing that actually if we don't take into consideration cybersecurity, some of the key costs would be direct impact to your business operations if disrupted. And some of these are also indirect costs, such as the loss of trust, as well as the business reputation that organizations have built up. So I think the natural question for the business leaders in the room listening in would be, why and how should we keep our organizations cyber safe? Actually, from our perspective, we think that a lot of the cybersecurity investment actually needs to start from the top, starting with the bosses as well as the business leaders. This is because the bosses are usually the one that make a decision on where to invest, where the organization is concerned, and the organization direction. Bosses are also the ones that would actually make a decision on the overall risk management of their enterprise. And if cybersecurity is going to be potentially an area, this should be incorporated into the cyber risk management as well. So I think if we were to start from the top, it's important for bosses in the room to think about it and see if you're actually playing a role model to cultivate cybersecurity leadership in your organization, and do you actually serve as the role model? Next are some of the preventive measures that we hope enterprises will think about in terms of protecting your information assets, whether it's the hardware, it's the software, or whether it's the data, which I think Tony has extensively covered in his first presentation. In terms of looking at assets, I think the other important thing to think about is securing your access and your environment. In the physical world, we would use locks to lock up our rooms and protect them from external attacks. So in this case, the equivalent is the passphrases. Are we using strong passphrases as digital locks to lock up our information? Are we having multiple locks in the form of multi-factor authentication for areas that are super important? What I've covered so far are largely preventive measures, but in cybersecurity, we always say it's not a matter of if, but when. So despite all the measures that we have taken to protect ourselves, we need to make sure that we are also cyber resilient so that if an incident does happen, we are able to detect it, be able to restore from it, and be able to recover from this incident. What I've covered so far has not gone into the human. I wanted to bring everyone's attention back to the Mastercard presentation earlier, where a piece of statistics was cited that around 90% of cyber threat incidents can be attributed to the humans or human factor. So actually, after we have put in place all the nuts and bolts, actually let us look at our employees, because they do serve as the first line of defense in our organization. I think the analogy that we have here is that we have put in all the right enterprise measures, and we want to ensure that employees are also becoming the ears and the nose and the eyes of our organization to help us to be aware and not be committing some of the measures that could inadvertently introduce malware and some other malicious software into the organization's networks. So I think what CSA has done so far is to release a series of cybersecurity toolkits for the enterprises to raise awareness. Some of them focus on enterprise leaders and SME owners, basically explaining why we think cybersecurity should be viewed as a business investment and it'll help to pay for itself over time. Early on, I mentioned the importance of having employees to be your first line of defense in the organization. So for organizations that may not already have cybersecurity awareness training, I would encourage you to take a look at the employee toolkit that we have developed, because this is something useful that you can download from our website and use it for your employee cybersecurity awareness training. For smaller enterprises, you may think that you are resource constrained and sometimes may not have the right personnel in the team to be able to look at all the various cybersecurity guidance out there. So what we are planning and curating is a toolkit for the IT teams that will come with some guidance curated for you, as well as tools and resources. For example, templates for tracking information assets, how to do planning for cybersecurity incident scenarios. So this is something that we're planning to launch early next year, so please do look out for it. So having taken enterprises on a journey from awareness to action, the next part is actually to recognize enterprises that have good cybersecurity practices and have adopted good practices. What we're also launching in time to come, early next year, is the Mark of Cyber Hygiene as well as the Trust Mark. These are cybersecurity certification for enterprises. So if you're a smaller enterprise with limited expertise and resources, actually you may want to consider getting yourself certified against the Mark of Cyber Hygiene. It will not focus on 100% protection because we recognize that this could be pricey and expensive for the organization. So what we will do is take on a prioritized approach and help you to stay protected against the most common cyber attacks. For the companies that have gone beyond cyber hygiene, you may want to consider going for the Cybersecurity Trust Mark. And basically, this will take on a risk-based approach. Simply because once we go beyond cyber hygiene, the profiles of enterprises out there vary considerably. And for this reason, it is going to be difficult for us to prescribe a certain measure, and therefore we have a guided approach to help organizations decide what would be the best measures that they need to put in place, bearing in mind their risk profile as well as the business needs. The key question would be, how would the mark of cyber hygiene and trust mark be used by enterprises? This is basically a voluntary scheme, and we think that it can be a competitive edge to businesses as they form business partnerships. What we have seen in the past year in the cyber industry is actually a slew of supply chain attacks where an organization may get compromised because of a weakness or vulnerability in one of its business partners, for example, in the software it uses or in a service provider. So I think in time to come, as organizations become more aware and cognizant about third-party attacks and supply chain attacks, they would start asking to you as a supplier, if you're participating in the project, whether you have demonstrated a minimum level of cybersecurity. And this is where going for a mark of certification and trust mark helps you to build up a visible badge of trust and to gain that competitive edge in partnerships that you're participating in. What I've covered so far, whether it's a cybersecurity toolkit or whether it's for the cybersecurity trust marks that I talk about, are very much government-led initiatives. So CSE recognizes that cybersecurity is actually a collective responsibility, not just government responsibility, but something that we want to work with enterprises on. So we have recently launched our partnership program, which is a platform for us to work with enterprises if there's interest to actually raise the cyber posture of enterprises together. So I think today, in a nutshell, I have very quickly covered some of the cybersecurity toolkits that we have released that is suited for the small enterprise, some of the upcoming plans we have for cybersecurity certification, as well as a partnership program for enterprises that are looking out to work with us and to partner. So I think I'll just want to thank everyone for your attention, and I wanted to hand the time over back to Karen to kickstart the rest of the discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Veronica, for your sharing. So to all the attendees, if you have any queries for all our speakers, feel free to type your questions in the chat function. And now I would like to hand over the time to Tony, who we will be moderating the fireside chat with the rest of the speakers.
Thanks, Karen. Let me invite Veron, Irugi, and Michael to participate in this fireside chat. I think thanks everybody for the interesting and insightful presentation, especially from Mastercard and CSA. And today we have an honor of having Michael from the SFA to kind of also be part of our fireside chat conversation today to bring a different lens to SME, right? So maybe can I start off with Veron? I think you bring a very interesting point, especially around the mark, right? We have trust mark and mark of cyber hygiene. But what was the key motivation from CSA perspective to put up this trust mark and cyber hygiene mark of cyber hygiene per se? Because I think we all know that SMEs, small businesses, they face challenge and they are looking for help, in short.
Yeah, so I think I would agree that when we talk about standards or cybersecurity certification, they're typically not discussed in the same breath as the smaller organizations, which is why when we went about developing the mark of cyber hygiene, we looked around the world to look at learning points and models to see how we could tailor it to be a bit more suited for SMEs. So like I said, it's really a journey. I don't think any enterprise just wakes up one day and decides that they want to go for cybersecurity certification. Usually it's a journey where they start with awareness that this is important for the business. And then the next question is, if this is important, what do I need to do, especially if I'm resource constrained? So this is where the toolkits come in to create that awareness, as well as some of the guidance to get companies started. And for companies that have reached a certain phase of their journey, I think it's important for them to be certified for cybersecurity, so that there is a mark to show that they have put in place some of these minimum cyber hygiene measures that show that they have put in place, some of these things that would assure you. So I think something that is important, simply because we do see that supply chain attacks is getting to be very much of a trend in the industry. And in time to come, suppliers will, or rather the customers will start asking, what would be some of the minimum measures that you have in place? In the absence of what we have developed or what we are developing, I think the typical answer would be, oh, please go for ISO 27001. So ISO 27001 is definitely a very valid standard, especially in this part of the world. But we also look at the statistics. There are 281,000 enterprises in Singapore. And in terms of the ISO certificates issued to Singapore, based on ISO 2019 survey, it was around 300 plus, which also tells us that it's probably something that is useful, but maybe not meeting every business needs. And there's probably room for a few other variants of certification programs to create that recognition for enterprises. To make it accessible to SMEs, we actually studied some of the overseas cybersecurity programs for smaller enterprises, namely UK Cyber Essentials, that has been launched a few years ago and has been quite successful. The other one is Canadian Cyber Controls, which also developed something that is baseline for the smaller enterprises. So I think in a nutshell, in order for this to be workable, it has to be designed for the smaller enterprise in mind, so that you don't think about the traditional standards that is very high bar for the larger organizations, something that's easily reachable for the enterprises and something attainable and achievable. And we hope to be able to get there with the enterprises in time to come once they have reached that stage of their journey.
Thanks, Veron. I have a follow-up question, Veron. I think it's very insightful that this trust mark of CyberSafe and the trust mark, right, actually have reference to some of the global standard. But you mentioned earlier as well, is a volunteer scheme, right? What is CSA plan to make it more widely available and recognized? Because SME today, SME no longer as the SME yesterday, right? They operate and work with enterprises globally and regionally. Trick question, but Ron, do you have, from a CSA's perspective, is there plans to promote this and create awareness around this, and how would SMEs can actually be participating in that journey as well in creating the awareness?
Okay, I suppose I'll respond to this from two lenses. One is locally in Singapore, and I think a second part of your question alluded to some global interactions. So maybe just to cover the local part in Singapore, certainly I think once we have launched, there will be plans to work with industry partners to raise awareness. We're hoping that there can be partners that can provide training for the SMEs if they think that this is necessary for them to get started in the cybersecurity journey. We're also working with vendors who are providing products and services, and hope to have this ecosystem of products and services that surround the marks of certification, especially for the SMEs. When they look at a piece of standard or certification, it's a lot of words and it's not so directly implementable. So what we hope to grow is this ecosystem of technology providers, solution providers, and services providers that can provide the services to bring the enterprises as part of this journey. So that would be some of the things that we're doing locally in Singapore. The next part of your question is, I think, talking about a bit more international lens. So I think for us to launch this in Singapore, we need to have done it in Singapore and be reasonably successful in doing it first. And then we can talk about potential explorations G2G with other countries to see if there are something like cross-recognition frameworks that we can embark on. In reality, today, I would say, based on the countries that we have seen, not that many have a cybersecurity certification for the small enterprise. The two that we mentioned that we know exist would be the Cyber Essentials in UK as well as Canada. What we see coming up is in Australia, they're also starting to look in and talk about cybersecurity efforts or certification for the smaller enterprises. So I think in time to come, as more countries jump on board this bandwagon, we should be able to more effectively have this G2G conversation across the different borders to see if there's ways for us to synergize on our efforts and come up with potentially some form of mutual recognition, cross-exemption, and so on, things like that. But I think this is something that would take time. Certification is certainly something of a long journey. Even for an enterprise to get started, it will take some time.
Thanks, Veron. Actually, quite interesting, right? So, Veron, you mentioned a lot of these things. It's actually SMEs themselves have to take the responsibility up and then do a bit of awareness internally and drive it, right? So, I want to kind of switch here to Uruj, right? If I got the ring correctly, you mentioned because
Yes.
it's the same thing that you mentioned in your presentation. Talk about learning journey, and what are your experience in setting up an SME setup that has limited resources and knowledge to carry out? What would you advise, or how will you advise them to start this journey? Because Veron, from a CSO perspective, there's a toolkit. What's the advisory from Mastercard, or do you see a synergy between the two? Uruj?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a great question. My response would be you have to start from education and awareness. And as I noted in my presentation, knowing what's coming at you is critical. You don't have to. You don't actually play sports with a blindfold on. You need to know what your adversary is doing in order to be able to better respond to their moves. So education and awareness gives you that understanding of what's actually going on around you. And I think, SMBs in the last several months, and especially in the last year and a half, have seen that they need to change, especially around digital transformation, which is an imperative now for all businesses of all sizes. And part of that change needs to be an attention to cybersecurity. So what we find with the SMBs is that they're more likely to have compromises in their in their systems, and where because they don't allocate enough resources to the employees, to the systems, because they don't have the awareness of what the impact could be to them. And while many of them are actually aware of the cyber attacks, they sometimes don't think that they're going to get impacted. They don't believe that they are actually at risk or that they're important enough to matter. And so they sometimes, also given the size and scale that they have, they may not have somebody responsible, a security person or an IT person looking after security. So even when they have these technical resources, there's typically a lack of prioritization. Think about it. I mean, if you're a small business, you want to put your money, if you're running a restaurant, you want to put your money in adding a table or if you're an IT business, you may want to bring on a graphics designer rather than spending money on something you don't understand. So I think to sum it up, you need to know, you need to be aware, you need to be educated, and you need to understand the impact that it could have on you and your business, regardless of size. And you also need to have some situational cyber awareness. I think these are the things that I would say are probably the most important starting points.
Actually, Uruj, there's one question that might be apt here, right? One question from Stephen. How do we encourage business owner to view as in business investment, especially for smaller businesses? You mentioned about business outcome, business impact, and digital transformation. Some of this, I feel that all this hype, right, are beyond them. So what would be like the 3 key things that we need to kind of highlight to the business owner in your words that can make them stand up and say, oh, we need to do this today. We need to do it properly.
Yep. So look, I think I go back to the point I made about awareness. Business owners need to understand the impact to their business of these types of events. And I think we don't necessarily do a very good job of explaining that. Some of the points that I made in my presentation or some of the statistics that we had in there, that, we look at it in businesses, 37% of businesses that are actually impacted by cyber events will cease to do business in 6 months of having suffered an attack. just because the cost of recovery is so extensive. The other issue that we run into when you're looking at incentivizing, cybersecurity or making it an investment area, is that it is very difficult to measure a return on the investment. And then if you're a business person, that's how you measure yourself. You want to see a return on investment. In the case of cybersecurity, it's almost about cost avoidance or avoidance of negative incidents. So there are certain hurdles, but again, I think, I wouldn't even say there's two or three things. I would say that there's really one thing that needs to be focused on, and that is awareness of why organizations need to do this and what the impact is to them and to society as a whole, right, of not making this kind of an investment. So I think a lot of what, the CSA is doing around these types of awareness programs around, and it doesn't have to be expensive, right? I think that's one of the things that also people think is, if I'm a small business, cost of cybersecurity is going to be very expensive. So we have to make them aware that there are solutions out there that are designed for them, that they can actually use and will fit within their budget. There are actually solutions to almost every budget. So these are some of the things that people need to be aware of and be educated on in order that they invest in the right places and do the right things.
Good point here. I think the thing that you mentioned is there's always a price and there's always a cost point where business can start off with, regardless where they are in the journey. I think that's a very good point that you mentioned. I think we keep talking about small businesses, but Michael, in the fintech world, right? Small businesses and startup, they are also small businesses, right? So in your case, because I think there are challenges for those fintech, is probably higher because they need to align and compete and measure themselves up to the banks. So what would be from your view that this fintechs that you kind of work with or you have interact with, right? How do you think that what kind of services they will need and how do they do it today? Challenges they might face because they are small as well, but they probably have to invest this even more than others.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes.
So yeah, it is very interesting, and from my perspective, I'm wearing the hat of the chairman of the Singapore FinTech Association Cyber Risk. So it is a very interesting role that I have because we have over now 1,000 members. As you know, the whole FinTech crypto industry has been sort of growing leaps and bounds. So there's a lot of new entrant into the industry, and primarily most of the fintech firms are SMEs. Of course, some of the larger banks are also offering fintech, but it's sort of a smaller amount. So what Tony says is very correct in the sense that as compared to I suppose other SMEs, I suppose the challenge is even higher because as a fintech firm, you need to sort of place yourself in a regulated environment. So MAS is one of the regulators. So the regulators will say that this is all my cybersecurity or cyber hygiene. This is my risk management standards, and it's a one size fits all, and it has to be the level that the big banks are able for the big banks as well, because you can't compromise when it comes to financial payment services. Because while the fintechs are SMEs, but they are providing payment services as well. So that's why there's recently this Payment Service Act, which most of the fintechs are applying for the license, So they do have to so-called match up with the big boys in that aspect. Besides regulators, you have to also understand that the clients of payment services as well. Some of the transaction volume of these fintechs can go into millions and sometimes even billions, you see. So it's very high volume of transaction. So the owners or the sort of expectation from the clients is also very high. So what do we do? So what can a SME type fintech firm do, right? So I work with them on a lot of sessions. So we say, okay, what we can't change. The first thing, we can't change the regulation because the expectations or the standards is high and is there for a reason because you are providing payment services. right? You can't change the fact that, like you say, being a small SME, you don't have the resources, you don't have the funding, as mentioned by our friend, that sometimes, if you do have some funds, you might want to spend it where it matters the most. So you don't have the so-called resources and the deep pockets like the big firms. So you can't change that as well. So what can you change? So I told them the only things you can change is your mindset, So, and we start with that, the mindset shift, right? So when it comes to risk management, the typical mindset, well, I have to say, especially for smaller business, is they go with a more reactive mindset to say that we are too small, we can't compete with the big boys, so we just react to it. Nothing, let's hope nothing happens. And if something happens, we react to it. But of course, we know that is a terrible idea, right? Because chances is something would happen, and by the time you react to it, it'll be too late. Right? So that's one approach, which is the typical approach or typical mindset that we are moving away from. Then you have your mid-tier mindset, which is your proactive. To say, let's not react to it, let's be proactive. But what does proactive mean? So as an SME, then you have to then sort of invest in your solutions, invest in consulting, and that can be very daunting because when you get quotation, for increasing your endpoint security or, and also getting consultants, the sort of top tier cybersecurity consultants, it can be very daunting because you know that even you invest millions, you have seen the big firms investing millions into proactively defend their cybersecurity, but still there will be breaches as well, right? You've heard even the bigger organizations, after spending lots of money, but they are not immune to breach or cyber attack. So the whole proactive mindset, like I said, is good, but it has to change as well. So what I work with our fintech is we have a more adaptive mindset. Because sometimes when you think about it, being sort of smaller or being young, into or new entrant in the market, you have the advantage. So one advantage is you don't have legacy systems, right? A lot of big banks, they already have a lot of legacy systems that or legacy cybersecurity systems, policies that they have already invested into, so they cannot get rid of it overnight. Then another approach, another sort of advantage that SME has is you don't need to have a big bang approach. So you don't need to roll out or protect to make sure that you have the best security for everything, right? So the adaptive mindset is said that, look, let's just do an assessment on our business because it's smaller than the big boys. So the assessment will be much faster, agile, right? So through the assessment, and let's see where our gaps are. So as mentioned, some of the gaps could be awareness, for example. If the gap is awareness, then maybe you increase your sort of investment or effort in terms of creating the awareness. Or maybe the gap is in certain other areas. Then you can work in a more adaptive mindset, and you can also test the system, even having some penetration tester to see where are some of your, I mean, at the end of the day, when it comes to your cyber threats or security risks, there is always a priority. There's always a few areas that you have the biggest risk as compared to the rest. So with a more adaptive mindset, I feel that that's how the fintech firms are able to quickly, sort of match up to the kind of cybersecurity or cyber risk management standards as the big firms. So I hope that's something that food for thought, that sometimes being, a new entrant or having a smaller size, I think with a sweep of the right mindset, that could actually bring you forward a lot faster and probably a lot more cost effective as well.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned is quite true, right? Today we are in an evolving world. There's no solution yesterday might not work today. In fact, tomorrow will change drastically in terms of what we need to set up in the security posture. But you mentioned about this adaptive mindset. Actually, I have a question back to you, Ruch, right? So, I think consistently what I hear from the team here is always about awareness and making sure that the business is aware. This is a thing. This is a necessary evil for them to operate in a secure manner. So, Uruj, in your experience, right? Because in terms of awareness, we talk about awareness. But what kind of KPIs need to be in place to drive awareness in the organization? because we can spend tons of money, but how do we measure that, or what kind of measurement do we put in place? What do you think, Yuruj?
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, I think gone are the days where you could do training once a year and get people to attest that they'd watched a boring series of slides that tell you some stuff on what's to do, what not to do. That just doesn't work anymore. We don't respond to that kind of stuff, and it needs to be more continuous in how it is administered and how it is delivered. So, SMBs especially, and all companies for that matter, I think what they need to do is they need to actually think a little bit more like a parent, right? When our child does something wrong, we admonish them every time they do that something. And we also but tell them how to get better, and we explain why acting a certain way is bad. And this is really what causes, it's positive reinforcement, and this is what causes the change in behavior. So we need to be able to do that as an organization. We need to have a program that prompts you, and there are solutions out there that will, if you're sending a message to everybody, it will say, do you really want to send this message to everybody? Or if you're including certain attachments in your emails, it will say, you have an attachment here. There's some sensitive information. Do you want to send that? Right. So it's little things like that you can do to continue to enhance it. It'll give you feedback. It'll give you guidance on what is good behavior and actually drive that change in behavior. Now, the point you're making about measurement, I think that is critical because we today, we look at metrics like how many viruses and how many systems are compromised and things of that sort. Again, I would say yes, that's important, but that is not what we need to focus on today, right? We need to be able to think about, how many touches did we have with an employee where we had to provide feedback, and was that feedback effective? If we run phishing programs in our organization, we should be able to very clearly show and talk about, which employees continue to exhibit detrimental behavior or bad cyber hygiene. So I think it's things of that sort that need to be reviewed and looked at, and we need to then connect those different dots to build profiles of good actors and bad actors within the organization. I think ultimately, if we do that, we'll have more success in driving better behavior. And look, I think what CSA is doing with the CyberSafe partnership, where they're taking that kind of an approach and giving the SMBs a place where you can collaborate on cyber awareness, where you can encourage the adoption of good cyber hygiene. These are all positives, because previously these things were not available. Everybody had to do things individually. But having guidance on this, and especially good guidance, I would say, that is critical, and that is a bit of a game changer, right? And again, shameless plug for our product, but what I would say is, we've actually partnered with CSA with Trust Center, and I think as I said, we want to drive awareness, right? And the awareness comes through many different facets and in many different ways of reaching out and connecting with people. So whether it's podcasts, people, if they're driving or on the train or walking to work, they want to hear something. So podcasts would be a good way of doing it. Videos are a really good way of actually communicating a lot of information quickly. So all of these types of things are available on a lot of websites, right? And especially also on Trust Center. So I encourage attendees today to go and take a look to explore that, because using those resources, they can actually start to build the KPIs that matter to them.
And thanks, Urush. I think we have Michael from Adaptive Mindset, but Urush actually introduced two concepts here: adaptive learning, right? Podcast can be a document, can be and adaptive control as well, depending on what the touch points of the employees are doing. As simple as sending an email, doing an attachment, we put in control, and rather than having one size fit all KPIs, Ilush actually mentioned a very good point here is because of the personas and the behavior and the role that every individual plays, the control and the measurement that we need to be in place also differs. There's something that we need to take back and understand. But actually, one thing also want to kind of go back to Michael in terms of with adaptive mindset, right? What do you constantly see the fintech themselves measure against? Because we talk about not KPIs, but what are the key concerns they have in today's cybersecurity realm for them, where let's look at it from a smaller setup where they might have constraint, right? What are the things that they constantly look for and proactively manage? Because I can also let the audience from the SME also learn from some of these tricks that the fintech does today.
Yep. Thanks, Tony. Before I go into that, in fact, I would like to add on to what Uruch have shared, in terms of the adaptive awareness. So I totally agree with that, but I think what is important, the quick wins here is it can be more practical as well, just like when we're in the building, remember how we always have fire drills, so we should have more cybersecurity drills, we should have managed phishing attack, or we should really have a simulation, so that the employees or the management, so what we call tabletop exercise as well. Because when it comes to cyber attack, it's very hard to be theoretical, it has to be practical, So I feel that it's really important if organization can take a more proactive approach into organizing this sort of, what we call simulation attacks, or phishing attacks, so that the employees can feel it for themselves what they should do in situation like this on a more practical sense. Yeah. So I think that would be a nice quick win as well. So, but on that note, I think it goes in very nicely as well, the whole fire insurance or the whole fire drill, right? In fact, nowadays it's probably more likely to have a cyber attack than a fire, right? But yet all businesses, even now when we are all working from home, we still pay fire insurance, So why not cyber insurance, right? So that's also an inroad to my answer. So some of the fintech companies we will look at, like you said, how do we sort of how do we ensure that we get into the so-called standard very quickly? So one way is to see what is the standard that the cyber insurance accept. So just like, how do I know I'm healthy? Very simple, get a health insurance. Because if I'm not healthy, then my premium will be very high, right? So this is a very sort of easy way to leverage on it. So if you go, let's say, to enroll yourself in cyber insurance, obviously it's their duty or their responsibility to make sure that you are assessed in the sense that you meet the criteria, and if you don't, they'll tell you where the gaps are. So that's one area that I think we should all be pivoting towards. And soon, I think all businesses, like I said, just like getting fire insurance, I think cybersecurity insurance will be just as common as that.
Yeah,
So,
I agree. Soon we have this common kind of cyber insurance. I think there's an upward trend of insuring and certifying businesses. I think, Michael, to your point, that's a very good point, right? In terms of what does good look like and how much do I need to do? I think that can form a first step
baseline
of your journey to say that as long as I hit that line, I am good enough, but I still need to do more. Having said that, I also add on, right? So because I mentioned about data, so cybersecurity as a whole, sometimes the folks mention when we talk about cybersecurity, we talk about systems. So I'll just add on, data as a whole is actually a very critical piece, right? Today, the data is the new information gold mine for any companies today. To your point, Michael, as well, there's also a need for fintech to start looking at this data as assets and how they should protect it. Because if you mentioned payment or banks as well, they actually they actually look at it separately, the system and the business and data. They actually have a standalone policies around how do we manage data, how do we manage and govern data access, and so on and so forth. And they have different sets of awareness program to do that as well for the companies and for the individual who have access to different levels of data criticality. So those are, I think that is also another area that adaptive mindset has to be in place, because constantly the data that the individual companies are getting more and more variety, because we talk about the IoT of the world. Those are no longer individual, those are like devices data as well, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
If you don't mind, I'd like to add on that. I think
Sure.
another advantage that SME has, I'm sure most of us who has worked or be engaged with the larger firm, I used to work for the Big Four accounting firm. So most of them have their own data center, all the banks as well, they manage their own data centers, they have their own policies. But nowadays, there's a move towards the cloud computing, right? So you can then leverage on the data centers of, Amazon's, Google, and this sort of big data centers who have all the policies that you need. In fact, they can do it so much better than most organizations because of their focus, right? So I think being an SME, one level is, of course, you need to have your internal data management policy, but you could also leverage on putting your data to some of these larger cloud service provider. Of course, you have to find out you have to ask them in terms of, you have to make sure that the policy aligns to what your business is, but I think that leverage is very important, because even the smaller law firms or smaller fintech firms that I see, that nowadays they have a lot more assurance, because unlike the past, you need to invest a lot in the hardware. After hardware, you need software, and then you need to invest in the experts, the people to manage it. But now all you need to do is to find the right cloud service provider, and have the right policies, and your data will be, was governed in a sort of in a secure fashion. So do think about that, having that leverage.
I think that's a growing trend, correct. So I have one last question for both Michael and Uruj, right? So we talk about protecting insurance, making sure that we adapt, creating awareness. So what happens in the event that is a breach, right? So we need a crisis management process or crisis management team. I'd like to ask both of you, in your view, what do you think is a successful crisis management team? Does it has to be dedicated team or a shared team? Because bear in mind, we're talking about SMEs, right? If it's a shared team, that means the shared responsibility. How does this team function? I think this is something that everybody talk about protecting, but we must always prepare that in the event happens. We need those guys, right? How do we do that successfully in a limited and well-organized fashion? Maybe I'll start with Uruj first.
No, thanks. Look, you're absolutely right. We know that, bad things are going to happen. It's, as Veronica was talking about earlier, this is about a matter of time, not an if. Let me maybe backtrack a little bit before I get to that point. I think what organizations have to understand is, how do they look to their to attackers, right? What is the when you think about your digital domain, your website, your digital presence, what do you look like? What kind of weaknesses do those attackers see? And then also, I think you have to be very clear about what kind of controls do you have within your organization that protect the data, the assets of the organization. Once you have that, you have a very clear view of where the risk is, where the protections are, and where the protections are not. And to Michael's point earlier, when you do these tabletop exercises, a lot of times they are they're actually done without context. But I think if you can identify what things look like and where what is the perception externally, what is the actual reality on the inside, you can do better drills. You can actually be better prepared to provide a set of readiness capabilities that wouldn't otherwise exist. So I think the response needs to be contextualized. It needs to be in line with what protections have been deployed and what kind of attacks you can expect to see. So I think that situational awareness that I was talking about, that is very important to have. But in terms of the team and things of that sort, look, there's capabilities that you can do in-house, but there's also things that you can do externally. And small, businesses, especially if you think about organizations like fintechs and so on, they need to think about partnering and having, companies that specialize in these areas actually provide those services to them. They still own the responsibility of it. They still have the, responsibility of actually making the policies and they're accountable for it. But the execution can be done by somebody else that they contract with. So I think it's important to judge on that basis and to figure out, how that's going to work.
Thanks, Virush. Michael, what are your views?
I think Rich have covered most of the points. But I think what we can look at is sort of a two-pronged approach, because every time there's a cyber attack, there's always an internal response, so the management team will have to respond to it. So, and the best way for the management team is to have some simulation or tabletop exercise, because every time before I conduct a tabletop exercise, I always ask this question, who makes the decision, who makes the final decision. And then before the tabletop exercise, they always tell me it's their CEO or their chairman, because in the organization, it always goes straight to the top. He's the commander in chief, right? But after the tabletop exercise, they say, no, cannot be the CEO or the chairman. It's not the right person. And even the CEO or the chairman will say, no, it's not me. We have to get someone who really sort of on the ground and, can make the informed decision at that time, So that's why having all this tabletop exercise and simulation is very important for the management team, so that at least between themselves, they know the roles, right? But that's just what you call your first level of defense. So I do agree with Uruch that if you can, the second level you should outsource. You should let the professional handle it. So once internally you have determined that this is what you can do or what you found out, then maybe get third party in. Of course, there's always different price points, right? You can go with the top consultants, but there are also very sort of more reasonable cybersecurity firms out there that offer you more of a retainer basis, or even insurance, right? Some insurance cover this as well. So again, I'm not here to sell insurance, but it's always a very viable option for SMEs, right? Because SME, you don't mind paying a sort of retainer amount, but when it does happen, you don't have to sort of worry about a big lump sum cash flow. So that's one option as well. But even if you don't do that, there are, like I said, a lot of other cybersecurity, more innovative cybersecurity consultants or service provider out there that can be on standby or retainer for a more affordable price. So always think of both, when this attack is your internal response and maybe getting external help as well.
Thank you, Michael. With that, then we end this fireside chat. Thanks for all the panelists in the discussion. I think the key takeaway point, hopefully for the audience here, is I think look for the mark, the baseline, right? What you need to shoot for in terms of getting your cyber hygiene to a certain level that is good. We also mentioned the awareness is a continuous process, and it has to be a regime that has to be continue to be oil within the organization. It's no one size fits all. It's not a KPI that you need to hit. I think lastly is really if there's in a small setup with limited resources, I think there are multiple options that we need to explore in terms of mitigating. I think one of the options that came up consistently is, do we want to look at it from insurance? We make sure that the company will still be viable in the event that something happens. Second thing is also to leverage on experts, because having a team member that's split between day job and doing this is not going to be something that is maybe of benefits to the company, because in the event we also need to do, before that even that happens, a lot of drills, tabletop exercise to make sure those mentality and mindset is drilled into the individual. It takes time, right? It'll take away precious time from actually running the business. I think these are the key things that we kind of gathered from this conversation. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for the panelists for your very insightful discussion. Thank you. I will pass it back to Karen. Karen?
Yep, thank you everyone for the awesome sharing. So with that, we have come to the end of today's webinar. So before we conclude today's webinar, we just want to share with you guys our next upcoming event. Yep, so we'll be having our upcoming knowledge series on the cyber threat intelligence on the 1st December. So feel free to join us by scanning the QR code and find more insights on cyber threat intelligence by our speakers. With that, we would like to conclude the webinar for today. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.